Pour écouter cette session en français, veuillez cliquer en bas de votre écran sur l'onglet Interprétation et sélectionner le drapeau français.
Hello, bonjour.
Barry Saleho.
On behalf of ICLE Africa,
the African Center for Cities,
Our Future Cities,
Red Cross Crescent Climate Center, and partners,
we're excited to welcome all of you
to the Rise Africa 2022 Action Festival.
Rise Africa has been growing since 2020
as a platform for thinkers,
doers,
and enablers,
committed to inspiring action for sustainable cities.
This year's theme is
creativity.
For me, this means blending skills to be able to communicate the climate change complexity in rapidly urbanizing cities.
I think we have such untapped potential in Africa when it comes to creativity.
I love the idea that we need to create space to be creative. I think so often we rush into trying to act immediately, and creativity is a good reminder to sit back and to really tap into the capacities we have.
I think agency is finding ways of giving power back to people, to groups, to young people, especially on a continent where it's a very young population.
The value, the inputs from the youths, people who are considered inexperienced have valuable contribution, and they're really taking that into consideration.
I think what agency means to me is change from the ground up.
The importance of urgency is the recognition of the past and the recognition that we've lost time.
Urgency is about acting now to build more inclusive, productive, and resilient cities.
Is this need to creatively redesign and unlearn and explore new ways of thinking.
The festival is hosting 33 sessions
with 135 provocateurs from across Africa and the world.
Every session aims to show new ideas,
showcase ongoing action,
and launch new initiatives, bringing participants together
to chart a new route forward.
We hope that the festival program will inspire you.
At the festival, we encourage you to showcase your business and projects,
build lasting partnerships,
unleash your creative potential,
commit to sustainable action.
Rise Africa is about translating ideas into action. What actions are you going to commit to this festival?
Before the session begins, it is important to note that you're being recorded.
And by participating, you are given the consent to be recorded.
All recordings will be available on the program page after the festival. Creative expression is vital for creating new futures for our cities.
And so we invite you to enter this session in the spirit of creativity and dreaming.
Je vis avec un mal dont je ne suis pas le porteur. Je vis avec un mal qui me donne de l'espoir. Atteint de l'albinisme, déficience intellectuelle, handicapé physique, malentendant, malvoyant, je suis dédaigné par la population. Exclusion, désaffiliation, je suis exclu de la société. Ils disent que je suis différent d'eux. Discrimination, marginalisation, je vis en marge de la société. Je suis la risée de la société. Stigmatisation, ségrégation, je proteste contre les travers de la société. Je refuse ce mode de vie. Inclusion, insertion, nous promouvons l'alphabétisation, l'éducation inclusive, l'accès aux infrastructures, l'accès aux services sociaux pour les personnes vivant avec un handicap, la création d'un système distributif pour réduire la pauvreté, la reconnaissance du travail non rémunéré, la réduction du chômage à longue durée, la valorisation de l'égalité pour toute la communauté. Je suis différent d'eux. Le handicap n'est pas une fatalité. Sachez que mon handicap a fait de moi une bombe à épanouissement. Sachez que mon handicap a fait de moi une bombe à épanouissement.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at Rise Africa 2022. Rise Africa this year is organized by ICLE Africa, Our Future Cities, the African Center for Cities, and the Red Cross Crescent Climate Center. This session is jointly hosted by ICLE Africa, the Dullah Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape, and the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. The theme of this year's RISE Festival is creativity, agency, and urgency. Today anchors the second sub-theme of agency, and this open session examines agency through the lens of human rights in African cities. We're all aware that the origin of human rights is hotly contested and many times is traced to the global north. In today's session, we examine very important questions. Questions like, is human rights African? Can we trace an origin of Africa to human rights? Did the fabric of pre-colonial African societies and cities have elements of human rights embedded in them? Was there an observance of human rights which predated colonial Africa in our cities? Is it true that historical evolution of human rights can be traced only to the north? These are some of the questions that we're going to be examining in today's session. We have a very rich panel today, and I'm super excited about what this session holds. And this session is going to be structured in quite differently than what happened in yesterday's open session. First, we have a webinar style where we would have two speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Bonnie Ibawo, a professor of history and global human rights at McMaster University in Canada. Professor Ibawo also chairs the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development, and he will be specifically responding to the question, are human rights African? Unfortunately, because of time difference, Professor Ibawo is unable to join us virtually in real time, but he has sent in a recorded message. After Professor Ibawo's message, we will be hearing virtually in real time from Ms. Joy Mboya. Ms. Joy Mboya is the founder of the Go Down Arts Center, a long-running multidisciplinary non-profit focal point for artistic experimentation, cross-sector partnership, and creative collaborations in East Africa. After these two speeches, we will take a break with a poetic expression from Nora Anyidoho. Nora is a young, passionate Ghanaian writer, performance poet, and a spoken word artist. After this, we would have a facilitated discussion. Ms. Gladys Mirugi Mukundi from the Dullah Omar Institute at the University of the Western Cape will be facilitating the discussion between a number of our discussants. Gladys is a researcher at the Socioeconomic Rights Project of the Dullah Omar Institute based at the University of the Western Cape. Our panelists at the facilitated discussion includes Dr. Elvis Fokala from the Center for Human Rights, who is currently the manager of the Children's Rights Unit. We would also be welcoming Ms. Remenia to share her insights as a Pan-African feminist architect and researcher. Remenia works on the intersectionalities of feminism, culture, and identity in North Africa. We will also be welcoming Ms. Christiana Asala, who is currently the National Coordinator of the White Ribbon Alliance in Nigeria, where she provides technical direction to programs, advocacy, communications, and policy. Christiana will be sharing her insights from a disabilities rights perspective. Finally, we have Mr. Tariq Tofa, who is the director of RE Think and Design. He's an architect, writer, and educator and director. And he's also an educationist and a design consultant based in Johannesburg. Tariq would be sharing his insights on the right to city and specifically from a migrant's point of view. And I will go first to the speech by Professor Benny Ibawo.
I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference for inviting me to this important conversation on human rights in the African city. So I have been asked to reflect today on the question, are human rights African? It is a complicated question that for the most part is predicated on the assumption that universal human rights do not adequately reflect African values, African aspiration, and African norms. It is a question that has preoccupied many human rights scholars, practitioners, and policy makers. So let us examine the basis of this assumption that has given rise to this question. Are human rights indeed African? If human rights, as we understand them today, are universal and inalienable, relating to people from all parts of the world, then it stands to reason that, of course, human rights are African. Africa, it's part of the world. But there is a basis for the concern that human rights, as we understand them today, international human rights, do not adequately reflect African norms. So let us examine the basis of that concern. So the international human rights movement and international human rights law, as it emerged in the middle of the 20th century with the end of the Second World War, the founding of the United Nations and the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, was predicated on an effort to address the crisis of nationalism in Europe. Following the end of the Second World War, the international community came together to try and put in place a framework for international peace and security, and human rights was at the center of that framework. But let's not mistake the key motivation for that agenda. The key motivation for the agenda as it emerged in the middle of the 20th century was to address the crisis of nationalism in Europe. We have to remember that in 1948, much of Africa was still under colonial rule. In fact, only 3 African countries were represented at the United Nations. So for the most part, Africa was shut out of the early debates in the United Nations about developing what has now become the international human rights system. So Africa was not part of the original conversation. I will add, however, that since independence, many African countries have signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights instruments. But it still raises the question, how adequately does this international human rights agenda that emerged in the middle of the 20th century after the Second World War reflect the values and the aspiration of African peoples and African society? And I think it's a very pertinent question that we must consider. And I'll give you an example of why I think it's a pertinent question that is relevant to the conversation we're having today. So in the 1960s, when many African countries were becoming independent, they had to confront this question about how adequately international human rights norms and values reflected their own aspiration. At the time, the aspiration was for self-determination, for decolonization, for an end to colonialism. And the international human rights, as it emerged in 1948 within the confines of the debates in the United Nations, really focused on individual rights. It was so individual-centric, and yet you had African nationalists who wanted the notion of human rights as it was emerging at the time to also reflect the collective rights to self-determination. African leaders and nationalists like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Leopold Senghor of Senegal, Farid Abbas of Algeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, all these anti-colonial nationalist African leaders had to struggle to put self-determination and the end of colonial rule on the international human rights agenda, at a time when most of the world, particularly the dominant imperial European powers, wanted to exclude self-determination from the emerging international human rights order. The preference was for a focus on individual rights rather than collective rights that would invariably include self-determination. So from the very beginning, there was a question about whether the narrow framing of human rights at its moment of inception adequately reflected African aspirations. But what has happened since then, as more African countries began to gain voices at the United Nations, we're beginning to see African perspectives integrated more and more into the international human rights agenda. We're beginning to see African concerns about communal rights, the complementarity between individual rights and collective rights, the relevance of collective duties and individual duties, and the symbiotic relationship between rights and duties. All these aspirations that have been expressed by African intellectuals and African leaders are beginning to make their way into the international human rights system. And we see these very clearly in some of the newer human rights norms that have been pushed by African leaders and intellectuals and other leaders in the global south at the United Nations. A prominent example is the right to development. These solidarity rights and collective rights that were really pushed at the United Nations by African intellectuals and leaders, and also leaders from the global south. We also see a very unique African perspective to the human rights debate in the African Charter for Human and People's Rights. So whereas the international human rights system, as it emerged in the middle of the 20th century, tended to be very individualistic and individual-centered, focused on entitlements by individuals against the state, the African Charter on People's Rights, on Human and People's Rights, significantly emphasizes not just the rights of individuals, but also the collective rights of people, the communal rights of people. The Charter talks about the duties of people. It talks about upholding African norms and collective values. And so it tries to balance this in a way that I would argue that international human rights hasn't done as well. These connections between, and in some cases tensions between individual and collective rights. So to go back to the question that confronts us today, are human rights African? My simple answer would be yes, because human rights, as we understand them today, are universal. We have a very robust international human rights framework. Does that mean that human rights are protected equally around the world? Of course not. What we have is a framework that can become the basis for really protecting and promoting human rights universally. But I would argue that what is required in the African context is what some scholars have described as vernacularization of human rights. In other words, a human rights, though universal, still needs to be vernacularized. It has to be translated into an African vernacular, into a language that is relevant, that is significant, that is operational for the peoples of Africa. Human rights in a way that makes sense to the ordinary man in the African context, that aligns as much as possible with local norms and local values. And I have to stress that this is not a culturally relativist argument. It is not a repudiation of international human rights. Far from it, it is actually a case for reinforcing international human rights in a way that makes it relevant to local norms. So the challenge that we have today as scholars, as practitioners, as people who are interested in promoting human rights in African cities and in African communities is to think about a way in which universal human rights norms, regional human rights norms, and domestic constitutional human rights laws can be interpreted and used to promote the welfare, the well-being, the dignity of peoples in Africa in ways that are relevant to their cultures. And that is the challenge that confronts us. And I hope that in the conversations that follow in this conference, we will have an opportunity to discuss how to make human rights real for peoples in the African continent. I thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to the conversations that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I must say that was an excellent speech. I agree absolutely with Professor Ibawo on the need for the vernacularization of human rights. And just even from practice and the way we see it expressed in some of the work that we do at ICLEI. And if I may just take 5 minutes, maybe to just give a very brief example in one of our recent projects in Ghana, where we had something called a learning lab, and we actually experimented on the vernacularization of human rights. The one thing is that when introducing human rights and gender discourse into very deeply patriarchal societies, you get this pushback where people are not necessarily receptive, because there's that conception around the continent that human rights are very foreign and that they're very Western oriented agendas and that they do not resonate with us as African people. And in that particular learning lab, the learning that we took there was to ask the participants to tell us about certain folklores, pre-colonization that predated colonization within their societies, which they resonate with, which particularly showed the protection of vulnerable people or vulnerable groups. And after we finished that exercise, what we did was to begin to trace elements of human rights from within those folklores, from within those stories. And there was a direct switch in the room at that point where people began to actually say, oh, so it isn't that, it's not that we do not have human rights within our cities as African, and it's not that predating colonization, we haven't had human rights. It's just that we iterated them quite differently. We didn't call them human rights. And I think that is a fantastic entry point, and especially for many human rights activists and for many human rights scholars on the continent, to begin to think around how do we iterate human rights? Do we stick to specifically Western concepts of human rights? And this is not necessarily to say that Western concepts are flawed or that there's anything wrong in them, but it's a question of how the people on ground are able to relate with those concepts and with the realities of human rights. At this point, I would like to welcome Ms. Joy Mboya as she takes us on a speech on the rights to the city. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And again, thank you to the organizers for the invitation to make a small intervention at this wonderful festival. I think it was wonderful to hear Professor Ibao open and give us a context really around trying to understand universal human rights, but also trying to see what an African lens, an intervention or contribution through an African lens might look like. I think that what I will share is really speaking to that a little bit, but a bit more practically in relation to the experience that we have had as an organization that is based in a city, that is trying to see how to mobilize agency within the city residents to participate in making and changing the city. So this idea of context, and I think Professor Ibao talked about the push in the 50s and the 60s as the continent was becoming independent, pushing for self-determination, but also pushing for the perspective of African principles and African values in international conventions, international charters, and so on. So context is something that I'll look at. Engagement, of course, which is agency, is how do you participate? How do you encourage participation? And then, of course, hopefully, how does that bring change and change for a better future? And because I work in an arts center, I think that I will work with the model of a story. So I will take you on a journey of a story of the city that we sit in, and a story of the engagement of our art center in that city. And then to summarize by just sharing a little bit around some of the ways in which we have tried to provoke and promote agency in building identity and ownership and fostering change in the city. So let me start by telling the story. and I hope I won't send you to sleep. So once upon a time in Africa, there was a city. It was an accidental city, a tangled up city, a confused city. It was called Nairobi. Nairobi stumbled into existence from a swampy stretch of hippo-filled cool streams to a boomtown of incongruous adventurers, traders, and settlers that later became a colonial outpost of the British Empire, to today's African city, nobody's city, everyone's city. Every day, since the country's independence, from villages near and far, thousands of people flowed into Nairobi to seek their fortunes, hoping for a better life. Soon, the city was staggering under the weight of expectations for schools, roads, houses, hospitals, playing fields, recreation. Little was done, so little changed. Challenges mounted, families suffered. Nairobi was turning out to be an unfriendly city, a cruel city, a dangerous city. People felt disempowered, disenfranchised. But a small non-profit arts center called the Go Down believed that Nairobi could be a great city because in the midst of the city's chaos, a bulging youthful population was humming with energy and dreams. And in their creativity and resourcefulness lay a reservoir of possibilities. So the Go Down began to reach out to these young urban dwellers, and together they explored the city's neighborhoods, their histories, and diverse communities. They took time to enjoy its markets, its parks, its nightlife, its music and art. And together, they imagined a better urban home, a better city. Year after year, the Go Down collaborated with Nairobi youth and residents to unearth the city's treasures. Ordinary people began to see why it was good to take ownership of their neighborhoods and their city. Because as they did so, their agency and their confidence also grew. The Go Down's experience showed how the city's identity, influence, and economy could be heightened through culture. And so around the Arts Center, an industrial zone undergoing change, the Go Down spearheaded a multi-stakeholder city regeneration process with architects, city planners, and placemakers. The city redevelopment of the Go Down into a civic scale complex was itself at the heart of the renewal, as were the voices and ideas of artists and school children, street vendors, everyday residents. Because for the Go Down, a sustainable urban renewal process was a people-centered process. And to help build the new Go Down and the surrounding area, a broad participation was invited. Ordinary people, successful people, corporations, social entrepreneurs, government, friends abroad, foundations. This ensured strong local support and wider relationships of goodwill. And so finally, the Arts Center transformed itself, but also transformed the surrounding neighborhood and public spaces. It became the first new post-independence cultural complex in the capital city, an enterprise that was timely and historic. Thousands of locals and visitors flocked the cultural precinct. Nairobi was now an empowering city, a self-affirming city, a confidence-building city. So this is a vision, this is an idea. Of course, we're in the process of actually doing this, in the process of realizing this. But I think one of the things that we are understanding around building agency is that we need to understand the context within which people arrive in the city, live in the city, feel included in the city, or feel excluded in the city, and to begin to see how working from the foundation of identity, of ownership, of belonging, we can build agency, we can build participation. I think we have tried to understand as we engage in our work as an art center within the city, looking at this question of sustainable urban development, we have tried to understand the entry points for citizen participation and for agency. And we found that actually there's several easy ones. One is within the city, there is always a city plan or a neighborhood plan. How do you enter the conversations around the changes that these plans imply? And how do you participate in those plans that will change and influence how you might live, how you might succeed or not succeed within the city? And then there is policy and legislation, of course. How aware are you of the policy and legislation that govern various aspects of your city? And how can you participate in informing the governors, the duty bearers, about the impacts and the influences of that on you? And then, of course, there is the public realm. The public realm includes public schools, public streets, the markets, the social amenities. How do these either impact your life negatively or positively? And how can you participate in how these public purpose, these public realm spaces and projects are actually part of how you build agency or exercise your agency? So as the go down, we have found frameworks that enable us to invite citizen participation and citizen agency into these processes. And these are festivals. The festival is a wonderful framework for bringing in citizen participation. Simple walkthroughs, neighborhood tours is another wonderful way of assessing and auditing your neighborhood and sharing what you're seeing and what you're not seeing. And then, of course, there is the whole idea of the city as a studio and how to engage in workshops very deliberately where you target specific problem areas, whether it's the environment, whether it's road safety, and so on as citizens. I think what we found in the process is that as you mobilize citizens to action, not only do you build their agency, but in building their agency, you're strengthening their commitment and their participation in future city projects. You're strengthening the idea of collaborative and collective practice, because the right to the city is really a collective proposition. But then also you're bridging the often big gap that we see between policy and the lived experience. And I think I will stop there and see how we can continue the conversation together. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very, very much, Joy. That was a brilliant, brilliant intervention. And for me, it's particularly when you emphasize that as you mobilize citizens, you build agency at the same time and also strengthen their rights to collective practice. But also beyond that, is also the idea of understanding people's specific context when they access the city. And this resonates very clearly also with what Professor Ibawo had mentioned about the vernacularization of human rights. And until we begin to actually take a deeper look at the context of people on the continent, rather than just imagining or importing certain frameworks from the West and believing that it should work here anyway, then I don't think we can begin to speak about true agency and people actually reclaiming their agency. Thank you very much. I think that we'll be able to have some time to engage more with your intervention because that was really brilliant. And I do know I have a couple of questions, but I believe that during the discussion session, we'll also be able to engage a bit with you more on that. At this point, we want to have a brief interlude with a recital by a poet, Joy. But before we go ahead to have that recital, I think that I should say a word or two before she comes on board. Rise Africa is a space for creativity, and we've always envisioned Rise Africa as that space where we at ICLEI Africa actually push boundaries. But in as much as we push boundaries, we are alive to the reality of many groups and many vulnerable groups specifically on the continent, including women. Now, we're alive to this reality not from a place of despondency, but from a place of acknowledgement of what should not, but unfortunately is, and also from a place of reclaiming power. The poem that you are about to listen to is a trilogy about the stark reality of women in Africa. It is about the uncomfortable lived realities of many women on the continent. May I request that if you're sensitive to or might possibly be triggered by words that describe sexual violence, you take this time to kindly make yourself a cup of coffee, to stretch your legs, and to join us in another 10 minutes after the poem is over. Nora, I invite you.
Hello, can you see me and can you hear me?
Yes, we can see you clearly and we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you so much for the introduction, and you've introduced the poem wonderfully. So I'm just going to go right into it. It's about the tale of two women, and it is titled God of the Namibian Skies. My name is Kate. I was raped when I was only 8. I can still remember the date when I went to Uncle Nate. Guess, but now he's late. Yet when I think about it, all I feel is hate. It's so hate. 2 decades of constantly thinking about how to revenge and retaliate. I could care less if I get bounced at heaven's gates, because after all, this is my fate. So I sit on my bed with arms around my legs, head on knees, and 2 streams of tears take source from a pain-filled heart and ceaselessly run down my cheeks. They gather at my chin and drop onto my thighs. I am tired of being tied and bound by these vicious shackles of vengeance, these vicious shackles that clutch tight around my ankles and my neck and my wrists, and they suffocate me and they bind me with bitterness. But tomorrow I will be free, free from my past. Where do I go? Who do I talk to? Everybody shoves my responsibilities in my face, but who fights for my right? Who cares that I am right? Today I sit and cry and pray to the God of the Namibian skies, but tomorrow I will be free. You used to be blithe, bubbly, and bold. Your name is Nicole, but of course, no one knows. You weigh 250 kilos. You've earned the name. Fat, so they mock you are black like coal, and coal doesn't belong among people with skins that shimmer like gold. So now your spirit is low and you've long lost your soul. You feel vile, wretched, repugnant, ugly. If only you knew that you are really worth more than gold. Every night I hear you pray. Slender body, longer legs, lighter skin, longer hair, to be prettier, your soul prayer, your soul goal. But God, like society, is just way too cold. God is an artist, creator, Obuade, you've been told. Well, then you must be the grotesque of his artist's art, you know. So you two sit on your bed With arms around your legs, head on knees, and two streams of tears take source from a pain-filled heart and ceaselessly run down your cheeks. They gather at your chin and up onto your thighs like you are tied and bound. Where do you go? Who do you talk to? Everybody shoves your responsibilities in your face. Black woman who fights for your rights. Today, you, this cocoon, kneels head between knees, begging the God who sits upon the Namibian skies to lighten your skin and make you beautiful. But tomorrow, you will realize how beautiful you already are. You will realize that you are a butterfly, and tomorrow you will fly free, free from your present. For decades, we have waited for 19 shiny armors, and we have knelt and begged and groveled and prayed. But if there are no nights, then tonight we wield double-edged swords. We carry our knowledge like an arsenal of weapons. We study, we learn, we fight. We stand up tall. We bear up our responsibilities and demand for our rights. And tomorrow will break forth at the break of dawn with a limp like Jacob's, but smiles that will paint our victory. Tomorrow, we will be free. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Nora. It wasn't just a poem where we only saw the struggles, but also a poem that gives hope. And for that, we say thank you very, very much. At this point, I'd like to hand over to Ms. Gladys Mirugi Mukundi from the Dula Omar Institute. May I kindly ask all our panelists to please kindly switch on their cameras as we go into the second session of this meeting. Thank you. We're still waiting for Tariq. Yeah. Who else? And Christy. Christiana? Okay. Thank you very much. Gladys, over to you.
Thank you, Fumi. Welcome to the second part of this session. In this session, we'll have 4 speakers. So it's conversational, and I want to thank Professor Ibrao and Joy Mboya for that insightful conversation to start us off. And perhaps I could go to Joy. I have a question. How can, in terms of the right to the city, how can agency and adaptive mechanisms reshape our city by instilling identity and expression of cultures in our African cities? Over to you, Joy.
Thank you very much, Gladys. A big question, because I think that the reshaping and the changing of cities, of course, is a journey. And I think that as Professor Ibao was trying to share at the beginning, it's a journey that starts from the making of the new continent. So how do you first of all shape nation, and within nations, how do we shape cities? And then within cities, how do we build agency? I think that in our experience, and certainly in my experience, the question of identity and belonging, of rooting, is a key one. Because if you feel that a place is part of your identity, is part of who you are, then you look at it in a different way. You begin to care about it in a different way. You begin to participate in it potentially in a different way. And so where you find that people are excluded, whether they're women, whether they're children, whether they're minority groups, whether they're people with disability, then you find that because they don't belong, because they're not included, then that sense of agency, that sense of participation, and therefore the ability to change and shape in order to make it better for you is something that is eroded. And so in our experience, one of the first things to do is to try and see, how do people begin to define and celebrate themselves within the city? How do they do that? And we've used the festival, the framework of a festival to try and kind of unearth that. How do people identify the points of heritage, the points of neighborhood, the points of engagement that connect to who they are? how they've grown up, their identity, their belonging, and then what do they do with that connection in terms of shaping and changing the city.
Thank you, Joy. That's very insightful. I think building onto that, what response, I'd invite Tariq perhaps to take us through on that question that Joy reiterated. How do people begin to define points of engagement in the city? And in this particular grouping with the migrants within the city. Tariq, over to you. Tariq, I think you're muted. We can't hear you. There we go.
Yes, good morning. I think the points that have been raised both yesterday and today were such fantastic points about vernacularization and agency and creativity. And they relate to all the things that we will discuss today. I think with regards to migrants in the city, a nationalization often brings with it conflicts within nations between who belongs and who doesn't, and who is an other. And where I'm speaking to you from in South Africa, we have a huge problem since South Africa became a democratic nation with othering within the borders of South Africa, what we locally refer to as xenophobia. And it's such a complex problem that is produced by so many different factors. The most underlying factors are the socioeconomic stress that many people live with and the daily struggles thereof. And another layer on top of that is government is often very weak or ineffective within those places of desperate need, particularly informal settlements. And very often these things spark off into violence. So in the same ways that we need to understand these issues in complex interacting ways, because that is how they are produced, we also need very clear strategies to try to address them. There have been many responses from civil society, which have been fantastic responses, humanitarian responses, trying to use culture to integrate citizens and migrants, dialogues that have happened, sports that have happened, really fantastic initiatives. Or one great initiative was by an NGO that actually formed a soccer team that won or came in the top position in virtually every league, and they were only blocked to go into the Premier League in South Africa, the South African Football Association, because their whole team was made up of migrants, and they wouldn't change the policy on that. But the point is, there have been such fantastic humanitarian initiatives from civil society, and it needs a collaborative effort from government where all the political will and political muscle and resources is, because they cannot engage with the phenomenon on the political level, which is how it is mobilized through political mobilization, the violence. So we really need to find, and something that was stressed yesterday as well as part of our idea of creativity. Creativity also means finding those collaborative models where civil society and different sectors, including the public sector and government, can work together to address these kinds of issues. So the problem is produced in complex, coalescing, intersecting ways, and we have to have very clear strategies to address that as well. And public space is part of that. How we build understanding them in co-constitutive ways, so we do many things at the same time with the limited resources that we have. I mean, that's what I'll just open with that point.
Thank you, Tariq. Thank you for highlighting that creative approaches are humanitarian initiatives are important, as well as, you know, the role of political mobilization among migrants. And now I'll move over to Dr. Folaka regarding the youth and children and access to the city. How can African youth be empowered to embrace agency in realizing their rights in African cities, to take up leadership and governance roles in a context of an aging leadership?
Thank you so much, Gladys and colleagues. Just to say, so far it has been amazing to listen to others. And if I may just speak from what Joy said, and Tariq as well, is that listening to Joy, my brain just kept going back to Nairobi to look at the flyover that is being built across the city. 4 weeks ago, or a month, when I was there, my question was, were children really involved in this design? Were children consulted in this design? Because looking throughout, as we drove right from the airport right into the parks or Keleleshwa area, it was difficult to see how a child will approve such a design and how robust it was in the city center. But now back to Tariq, we just need to agree that if we look at migrant children or children in that space, they are never consulted. They are not even heard, and they are not given the opportunity to speak. The ability of a child to raise or to commit an opinion to any design that has to take place has not happened in this continent, and it has no sense or any point of view where it will happen. The reason is simply because certain aspects we are given, and we as parents, when parents are given these aspects, they transfer them to their children without proper consultation. And I'll give you very brief examples. One example is the fact that most of us in this continent now, we dream of bullet trains. I've never heard a child speak about bullet trains. And we speak about having bullet trains in our cities, we speak about having all of this. There's nothing wrong with that from a developmental perspective. But if we need to have an inclusive approach of speaking to those who live in the city, then it is important that we do touch base with all these different groups. It is difficult to have a comprehensive consultation on such issues because most of them do require technical know-how in order to design. Architects know exactly what to do. My beef with architects at this point is that there are two colors that we have. And if I mention these colors, you are able to place the gender on each of these colors. They are not African, pink and blue. The moment I mention these colors, you are able to identify which one falls in which group, in which child group that it will fall, either a female or a male. You know exactly where it falls. Our cities are continuously being designed, and parks that are meant for children are framed in a way that flash these colors depending on the gender that we want to attract in certain parks. Children have been given these colors. They have accepted them. If you look deep into our African culture and the way that our dresses or African outfits are designed, you will hardly pick the color pink in that space or even identify any gender to any specific color. That is how inclusive our cultures have been. But so far, given that we have accepted and embraced what has been given to us as modern, as up to date, we have transferred this to our children without properly consulting them. I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Folaka. And building on to that, I want to invite Menia, and the question to you, what are some practical things that can be done to make public participation meetings accessible, safe and comfortable for a diverse range of citizens?
Thank you very much, Gladys. I think that before speaking about women in the African cities or in the public space, we must admit that as women, we face a double-edged sword. From one side, we have a sociocultural crisis that tends to erase women's presence in the public space. And then from the other side, we have the patriarchal conceptions and norms that push women to erase themselves because, for example, public spaces in North Africa facilitate male supremacy and dominance over the city. And I think that these two aspects make women's presence in the city very limited in several ways, whether it is in their freedom to move, in their freedom to sit where they wish, to occupy the public space, their freedom to choose where to go and when, and also their freedom to choose with whom they can occupy the public space. And I think that when designing the cities, except the fact that should become a practice, a constant practice among architects, urban planners, and policymakers, there's this aspect of visibility. African cities should be designed and enabling for women to be seen and also to see the city and to be heard and to hear what is happening in the city. The second thing, I think that spaces should not be exclusive to one gender over another. And this is something that I've noticed in North Africa, but also in other African cities where some cafes, for example, are exclusive to men. And I think also that as our keynote speakers mentioned, we need to recall our practices that we used to have before colonization. We used to have a public space that is inclusive. I'm thinking here about the Baraza among various communities in Eastern Africa. I'm thinking about Imbizo practice among the Zulu in Southern Africa. And what I wanted also to highlight is the Tejmat, which is a practice in North Africa among the Amazigh, the Berber population, which is a decision-making space that is genderly equal. And it was endangered by diverse dynamics, especially colonization and religion. And now in the post-colonial African culture, we are encouraging the emergence of contemporary conceptions that exclude these traditional practices that can be considered as feminist and inclusive. And I think it's maybe time to think about these practices and to see how we can include them in today's planning of our African cities. And one last thing I wanted also to highlight is that we need urban policies that are progressive, that from one side ensure women's inclusion in decision-making, but at the same time that are able to evolve and to absorb new practices, new social norms, diverse occupations of the city and of the public space, including the gender aspects to be taken into consideration when designing the cities. And I think that the incapacity of African cities today to absorb new practices is only exacerbating social and gender injustice in the continent, but also in some sittings in North Africa that I had the chance to witness.
Thank you, Menia. Thank you for linking that, highlighting the social cultural crisis that women face in engaging in the city. And back to Dr. Folaka, and how children are not involved in decision making in terms of design and planning of cities. I appreciate that you have highlighted that in African cities, indeed, there were mechanisms that we need to go back to, such as the barazas, to reinforce that participation of children and women in the city decisions as well as policy planning. I now want to invite Christina, and the question to you, Christina, is what do you think? Do you think the African Disability Protocol has made any impact in realizing the rights of persons with disabilities in our cities?
Thank you so much for the question, Gladys. Yes, absolutely. I think it has. I mean, it has provided an elaborate framework on disability with about 164 countries, as signatory. It also created a platform for conversations, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs has led a number of conversations on promoting accessibility and advancement of persons with disabilities, and creating, an inclusive society. The most interesting part, of the CRPD is the move away from a charity or medical approach to disability to a social and human rights approach, and emphasizing respect and dignity of persons with disability. But the very question really is, how aware, how aware are policymakers, of the content of these documents? Now, looking into my country, a month ago, we had a consultation with persons with disability, looking at the aviation rights. And a lot of people in the aviation sector did not realize that there was an aviation right on people with disability. They were shocked to hear that. And a lot of people, that even travel do not even realize that they have the rights, to some requests. And it was an interesting conversation, really, because people were able to bring out the policy documents and review what is in it. Now, I realize that a lot of people really do not understand the subjects. And that's why, people are not being, are not held accountable, to what it, and, the environment we also need for people with disability to thrive are not existence. So really, I think they need to, we need to begin to really talk, and I'm happy that we had this kind of conversation where we're able to shed more light, on issues like this. And this needs to go on in most of our cities. So people are aware, from the policymakers that need to create enabling environments to the people themselves, to have the right information, to make decisions and have the agency, to call and to ask for, what, is accrued to them, but also hold governments, to account.
Thank you, Christina, for highlighting how the government engages persons with disabilities in the city, especially on that aspect of fostering agency, is a key point. And I want to go back to Tariq on the right to the city. And my question is, how can inclusive human settlements through achieving the right to access to housing realize social justice in African cities?
Yes, I mean, housing shortage is a key issue in virtually all the major cities of the continent, which are urbanizing, and they're all going to be faced and are already facing housing shortages. Within the South African context, the main model we have is housing mega projects, huge projects that are usually built on the periphery of cities. By and large, that is where they have been built over the last decades. And they come with many challenges because they're far away from economic opportunities, there are long travel distances, there are all the expenses that come with living so far away and not living in a livable environment where there are social resources, cultural resources, economic opportunities, etc. So that model it does not work very efficiently, and we all know this already. So we are struggling to come up with new solutions and strategies. Now, the way people build housing themselves in informal settlements or generally known as slums, people find spaces within the city, especially migrants, because those are the first places they go to. Those are the low income places, the places where you don't have to spend a fortune for rental. They migrate and those become arrival cities, those informal settlements on the peripheries of cities generally. And we have not yet learned how people are, what we can learn from so-called informal processes, how we can develop other kinds of housing solutions that are not necessarily top-down, that do not use the big corporations and construction materials, but trying to understand local systems and working with those informal processes. That is something we haven't yet really found a way to do that. And so we haven't really been able to meet the multiple challenges that we face. And human settlements is not just about producing a shelter for people, it's about producing a living environment with all of its complexities, social, cultural, economic, familial, And so the issue of migrancy, of xenophobia, of xenophobic violence is also part of creating human settlements, because in South Africa, the citizens don't really know how to live with one another because of our long, centuries-old colonial history, which we share with other parts of the continent, and our apartheid history, which is also shared with settler societies in other parts of the continent. Apartheid is not so much a unique South African phenomenon. In the early parts of the 20th century, apartheid was almost, some scholars have said, almost a continent-wide African phenomenon in urban spaces. So human settlements is also about this. How do citizens even live with one another? How do we create social cohesion among citizens? And then the migrants issue is even another layer. How do we live with people that have come from other parts of the country, internal migrants or external migrants from beyond the border? So there are so many challenges, and we are still, we haven't yet even developed on scale the strategies to deal with them. But those are some of the issues that human settlements have to address, that it's not just about shelter, but it is about where you locate those settlements, where you build them. Does it provide economic opportunities? How does it facilitate and help people to live together, both among citizens and also amongst migrants? And is it close to economic opportunities where people can actually have a dignified life? Because and I'll end just with this point, one of the three of the most fundamental things that we need to live in a humane way is you need family, you need food, and you need safety. All human beings need these things. And we are struggling to even fulfill those basic dimensions of dignity and respect that we need to have in the city. And human settlements, the way we understand them and how we build strategies, has to accommodate all of those things and not work against them. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq, for highlighting that human settlement is indeed more than just shelter, that it's about social cohesion. I appreciate that. And building on that, I want to ask Menia to, build on that and tell us more or share more practical ways of how we could include women in the design of public spaces so that we foster dignity and safety. Menia, over to you.
Thank you very much. First thing, I think that we should not frame the question that way, saying how we should include women. I think it's up to women to include themselves and to impose their presence, because we have seen so many events where women were invited to add their voice to decision-making, but they were generally considered as beneficiaries instead of effective participants and decision makers. And I think that the first thing to do is that we need more women leaders in the domain of urban planning. We need more women architects. We need more women designers who will have, first of all, this sensitivity regarding their experiences as women in the African city, but at the same time, who will have the expertise and the feminist lens to design an inclusive environments where they can guarantee their safety and their comfort. This is one practical way to do it, I think. And then there are other ways. I'm thinking about an initiative that happened in Morocco in 2019 or 2018 by the Movement for Individual Freedoms, who decided to rename or relabel the streets of the city of Casablanca by the names of women figures. And that's also a way of claiming the space and pushing for our presence there as decision-making agents, and also claiming for our right to be there. So what they did is very symbolic, but at the same time, it highlighted the reality that we are not represented in the public space. And if we don't do it ourselves, we cannot expect others to invite us to do it or to do it in our place. And then in the same perspective of thinking, there is the case of the Algerian 2019 revolution, the Hirak movement that happened to push down the former president of Algeria, Abdelaziz Bouteflika. And what happened during those protests is that a feminist organization in the country took the opportunity to say that we need also women's rights in this revolution. So what they did is that they created what they called the Feminist Square in the center of Algiers, where they protested with the other citizens, but who also claimed women's rights as part of the popular demands. And what happened after that is that they were attacked twice by the protesters, who assumed that it was not the right moment to claim for gender equality. However, 2 or 3 months after, they were always invited to join the conversation happening during the protest, and also who had their own space in the protest. So protesters won't go to that space because it's the Feminist Square unless they want to claim their demands with them. So I will just go back to what I've said earlier. I believe that we must make sure that women's participation in decision-making processes and in different community conversations is intersectional and inclusive all the time, and that we are the ones who should claim our space and who should design our policies and include them in more general urban policies to design cities that ensure and guarantee our safety, our comfort, but also our representation.
Thank you, Menia. Thank you especially for bringing in that aspect of the women. We need more women designers, and we need more women leaders to fit into these spaces to ensure that there is the sensitivity required in decision making. Building on that, I'd like to invite Dr. Falaka, and my question to you is, in designing these public spaces, could you share practical examples and ways using the children's rights approach to make the cities accessible, safe, and inclusive to the needs of children?
Thank you, Chair. If I may, Gladys, if I may pick up from where Rim ended, is the fact that we have, and from all the conversations that we had from the beginning, we have an established fact that children do have a right to development. It is established both in the African Children's Charter and in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So the issue of right is not disputed. But what is disputed generally is the issue of consultation. I mean, I also add that children also have a right to be heard and or to participate in all decisions that concern them. So that is also an established fact. The issue now is the aspect of willingness and the ability for states and designers, architects, and those who design these frameworks of cities that we all have now, the willingness to involve children in such spaces to make a decision. The issue of ability and capability to contribute to the design of a city is exactly what limits children's participation in such spaces. They have been judged already based on their size and their ages, based on the fact that these are people with a developing mindset and people who need to grow, to age, in order to understand technical issues such as design and architect. So in most spaces, children are reduced to the point where they just have to say, I like or I don't like this. And what plays out in the like space is what the technical designer takes as acceptable. And what does not play out in the unlike space is what a designer also deems fit as not acceptable within a city. The image of every African city is designed in one glass room, or you call it the way you like, top floor office, where we want to see our cities have bullet trains. We want to see our cities have children's park. Not many of our cities today, as we speak, has parks for children to play. Not many. And you do not need to go so far, but to get to Addis Ababa, for example, which many have defined as what they say in French, a chantier, you know, a workshop or a working space where they are designing and building so many things and so many skyrocket buildings. There is no single park in the middle of Addis or in the Bole area to accommodate those diplomats that come and with their children. All of this is not a mistake. It is intentional because children were not consulted when all of this were being designed. If they were, there would probably be a park for them to jump and to play around. If we go back, and so very few cities, for example, Johannesburg, that does have parks within them. But if you look at the state of those parks as we speak, and I'm sure Tariq is going to concur here, is that 10 years, in the space of 10 years, most of these parks are dilapidating. Some are being rejuvenated in other spaces, and some are now embracing different aspects that will involve children. Adults imagine, they do imagine and think for the child and think the child would like this. But there are different elements that play in the space of a child. You have the female, and you have the male or the girl child, and you have the boy child. They have inherently different likes and dislikes. And to involve children in these spaces, as I said before, has reduced to the point where, what color do you want us to paint this? And then they go with the colors that they have been given, or they feel like they like such spaces, such colors. They must be bright, they must be welcoming, and then they will not make that contribution. The reason why most of our parks are bright and inviting is not because the architect made that choice, it's because children over the years have established themselves within the frame of designing as loving bright, flowery, and inviting colors. Architects have just borrowed that idea, but cannot claim it because it all came from a child's framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for highlighting practically what consultation and participation of children in the city should involve. And now I move over to Christina, building on to what Tariq, Menia, and Dr. Folata have just said. In terms of human settlement and being part of social cohesion, I put it to you that many traditionally held beliefs about the causes of disability are still prevalent in our cities. Can you tell us from your perspective, how do you think this has affected the response across the region, both from the state and non-state actors, in ensuring that our cities and spaces are inclusive to all, including persons with disabilities?
Thank you so much, Gladys, for that question. And I am answering both as a mother to a child with disability and also an advocate, for the disabled. Is that really in our society, long-held beliefs, on what disability is, and the causes really limits our response, both, state and non-state actors. And let's just take a quick look of what is really disability. Now, many people see disability as a condition, that is inherent in the person. For example, a medical condition that requires a person to be in a wheelchair, or take medication. Now, however, the concept, of disability perceives disability as an interaction really between an individual personal condition, such as being in a wheelchair or having a visual impairment, or environment factors, like negative attitudes, to or accessible buildings, now which, together lead to disability and affect an individual's participation in the society. Now let's look being in a wheelchair as a personal factor, for example, combined with living, in a city with accessible buildings, which is an environment factor, leads to participation, in the community in terms of someone who is not, in a wheelchair. Now, there is little or no disability when we have good accessibility. Now, having, say, intellectual impairments, as a personal factor, combined with, belief in the community that persons with intellectual disability lacks the capacity to vote, which is a negative environmental factor. Now, it leads to exclusion from society and denial of the right to vote. That in itself is a disability. Now, personal factors really are multi-layered and can both be physical, social, economic, looking at physical factors like gender, ethnicity, impairments, size, weight, and so on, and also socioeconomic factors like wealth, class, inclusion in society, personal factors that interact with exacerbate disability or can even alleviate them. For example, a person with physical disability who is wealthy might be able to access tertiary education, for example, and find a job. This might increase participation in society and elevate disability to an extent. So looking at, what disability really is and, different approaches to disabilities in our cities. Now there is the, now again, disability exists, in different cities, some being more dominant in some parts, than others. Now, a lot of people see disability from a charity approach, that's treating people with disability as passive objects, of kind of acts of welfare, payment rather than being empowered individuals with the rights to participate, in political and cultural life in their development. Other people's approaches in the medical, focusing on, the person's impairments, which is of course represented in the source of inequality. Again, the needs of the right of persons, are absorbed, or identified with medical treatments provided on the patients. Now, looking at also the social approach, which is quite different thinking, seeing disability as the consequence of interactions of individuals with the environment that does not accommodate the individual's differences. Now, this lack of accommodation impedes the individual's participation in society. Now, I'm trying to draw focus on the human rights approach to disability, which builds on social approach, by acknowledging the person, with disability as subject of rights and the state, and others having responsibilities to respect these persons. Now, it treats the barriers in society as discriminatory and provides, avenues for persons with disability to complain, and when they are faced with such barriers. So really, it's the fact that a lot of people view disability from medical approach, from social approach, or from charity approach. But the question is, how many people understand the human rights approach to disability? And when we start, viewing disability and responding to disability from the human rights perspective, it really puts everything into perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I identify with how you brought in the multi-layered barriers and the intersection between socioeconomic factors and how that exacerbates inequality in terms of accessing the city for persons with disabilities. Thank you for that. And now I want to direct my question to Joy. In terms of the working class as a group, how can we include the working class as key stakeholders in decision-making processes about how our cities are developed, especially when such processes are organized from an academic and technocratic perspective? Over to you, Joy.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think, a really important question. And I think one of the challenges that we have, I think, is sort of connecting or bridging the space of ideation and conceptualizing, and the space of practice and implementation. And I think that what's happening now, of course, for those urbanists and people who are interested in the urban space, is that many tools are being developed that begin to bridge those and enable the idea and the practitioner to be brought together. I'll just give an example of one that we have been working on. In the neighborhood that we occupy as an art space, it's a neighborhood that the streets are vibrant with street vendors, you know, sort of micro businesses, whether they're the motorcycles, whether they're fruit sellers, or, you know, roadside hotels and so on. And in trying to change our art center and therefore change the streets as well, we are very much aware that those voices that sit right outside of our boundary on the streets are really part of our community and our neighborhood. And how do we include them? And we have, over time, in this process of trying to change our physical space, worked with them in many different ways. One, of course, is visiting and interviewing. What is the conversation that you have with somebody? Because that is one of the easiest ways. How do you engage in conversation with somebody around their experience on the street, and what they would like to see changed, and how they would like to see that changed? So one has been interviews and conversations. Another one has been walking through and taking an audit of that neighborhood with them as well, and sort of saying, you might have your little boda, you know, your motorcycle park here, but up the road, there's a lady who sells bananas. She's actually a person with disability. You can see that she sits in the middle of the road. You can see that there are bicycles and pedestrians and others passing around her. How do you think we can look at the whole neighborhood and just not your specific problem in terms of making this work for all of us? And so the idea is to take an audit together, to visit the space together, which we have done, to document this through simple phone photographs, working with your phones, questionnaires. If you can't read or write, there's somebody who can do that on your behalf. So really trying to enable people to express and voice, and not to work with the limitations either of literacy or the limitations of technology, that you don't have a phone and so on. And in this way, we found that there has been an opening up of the neighborhood in a way that every weekend when we went there, and this exercise is now finished, there was an eagerness and a keenness to explore more, to aggregate the data, to analyze the data, and then to suggest ideas. And the suggestion of ideas then again is another process. How do you do this? Do you draw? Do you write them down? Working with children, we worked with paints, we worked with drawing. If you're working with young women, how adept are they at digital technology? How quickly can you teach them to work with something like a Minecraft? And it's actually very quick. And therefore, how do you begin to see the ideas, wishing to see more color, wishing to see more green, wishing to see more pedestrianization and so on. So I think this idea of creating better spaces, which can sit at the level of the professional, the academic, is something that can be trickled down just through simple methodologies of audits, workshops, conversations, interviews, questionnaires, drawing, and so on, that then begins to bring the voice and the experience of the ordinary person on the street. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. I appreciate the sharing of practical tools to foster agency and ownership, as simple as taking a walk in the neighborhood, taking audits, taking photographs, having conversations. I think that's a very important tool. Thank you so much for sharing that. And now I'll move on to Menia. It's about women's rights and what actions should be put in place to ensure that the continent is moving towards attaining the Gender Equality Agenda 2063, allowing women to fully exercise their right to the city. What actions should we put in place to make it practical?
Thank you, Gladys, for the question. And this is something that I say almost all the time. In Africa, we still have 41 years to make it happen, because for the SDGs, it's a little too late, but we have 40 years ahead to achieve Agenda 2063. And I think that the aspiration 6 of Agenda 2063 is very clear. where it aspires for an Africa whose development is people-driven, and that relies on the potential of African people, especially women and youth, and caring for children. And I think that from this, we can already understand that it requires that we live in a more inclusive society where all citizens are involved in decision-making, and involving them should be intersectional. And this is very important. So I think that the actions that should be put at this moment to achieve gender equality of Agenda 2063 is the role of the member states of the African Union and the African Union Commission commissioners. So from one side, I think that member states should be aware of the intersectionality of gender and urban planning that Agenda 2063 calls for when including women in the cities. I also think that many citizens, and these are conversations that I had with comrades, with other researchers on the continent, is that they are not aware that such agenda exists. And I think that at this point, we need to bridge the gap between what is happening at the intergovernmental level and what citizens are aware of. And I also think that we need to bridge the gap between policy and implementation. It means that we need to encourage member states to design and implement national and regional plans to achieve gender equality as part of Agenda 2063, because it's good to have an agenda. It's good to speak about gender equality. It's good to insist on including women in all aspects of life. But if this is not followed up by effective and practical action plans that are implemented in the member states, it won't have very concrete outcomes. And then, of course, in policy creation and then in the implementation phase, member states should open the opportunity to women leadership and governance and ensure equal quotas of representation. And at the same time, women should ask for their space in the policymaking committees and also for their quotas when it comes to discussing the implementation or the policymaking of national plans in the scheme of the Agenda 2063. I'm not an expert of this agenda, but I think that we can make things happen. We just need to be aware of the agenda and try to share it with citizens and work collaboratively with governments as well to have what we want and to have our voice included there.
Thank you, Minna. Thank you for giving us practical examples of how we can bridge policy and implementation on the Gender Equality Agenda 2063. And now in closing, and I want all the panelists to consider this question, and then I'll give you a minute or two to respond, starting with Dr. Falata. I see your hand up. This session really showcases many moving parts that need to be considered throughout any and every design process. How can implementing this very nuanced aspect and universal design elements be included more easily into everyday design processes? Salvik, maybe we start with you,
yes.
And then yes, and then we'll go to Christina.
There was a bit of a break there. I don't think I got your question properly. But the reason why my hand was up was just to support what Joy was saying earlier, is that it is, for me, I'm not an architect. I mean, given that in my space and being a bookworm, as I might use that word, is the fact that for you to know, it's very simple, the way I look at it from a layman's perspective, to know that people, migrants, women, disabled, have not been consulted, is when you look at the parks, the way the parks are designed. There is a pedestrian path, and then there is a lawn path. Most of our parks are done that way, right? And then you look at how people walk, the way they have to move to cross over to go to the other park. People just walk. In some cases, they walk across the lawn. In other words, those people were not consulted before that path was designed. The intuition was that this is how people should walk. Their opinion was not sought to say, is it easier to walk through the path this way rather than go the other way around? So it ends up that if you go to cities, for example, Douala in Cameroon, or you go to other cities across the continent, you will see that the pedestrian path, there will be a pedestrian path across the lawn, and there will be an official path which has a pavement, which is what a designer thinks and wants people to go across with. Now, if you have to address that pavement back to that pedestrian path, you will see people use it more. Because according to them, this is how you get easily from point A to point B. But the lack of consultation leads us to such spaces. But again, we're speaking about human beings, so you cannot really have it on 100% that this is exactly what it is. But at least from experience is that this is the way people want it to go. But the lack of consultation and even the spaces where children belong. And if I may just pick up a bit, I think I have a few seconds, from what Rim said and Agenda 2063, for us, we have the Agenda 2040. Tomorrow, we are receiving guests that will come to Pretoria in order for us to ascertain the level to which children have been consulted in the implementation of the SDGs, Agenda 2063, and Agenda 2040. Now, all these agendas want to see the extent to which children have been involved. We conducted a continental study, and now we are examining or validating the study to see. I can tell you, given the fact that I've had the privilege to read the drafts of the report, is that it is almost next to a 0% consultation. It is still in the space of where adults think that the issue of capability and presumed ability, children are presumed in most spaces, and that children now are being told and controlled and directed to what adults and administration thinks that is positive for them. But the approach that Joel raised just now, consultation, speaking to the people, and having an inclusive design method in every city, and not specifically for individuals based on their abilities and their disabilities, that could work. And please do not forget children in this space. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Menia, over to you. And thank you, Cassie Westcott, for the question that we're using as the closing, for the closing session. Over to you, Menia.
Thank you, Gladys. I think that Dr. Folaka said everything. I would just say that we also need adapting what Dr. Folaka mentioned to women's presence and women's rights in the African city. It's good to have consultations with women when designing the cities, but it's more important, as I said in the beginning, to have more women architects and more women designers and more women urban planners and more women decision makers who can ensure that our voices are well represented. And something else I wanted to highlight is that, so I did architecture school of Algiers, and for 5 years, we never, ever discussed the traditional spaces, the local savoir-faire in North Africa or in Africa in general. And I think it's maybe time to change the system, the educational system, because we have examples from our traditions, from our ancestors that can be adapted today to the contemporary urban space, and that would work because they were designed in a context that is our context. They were not influenced by colonization or religion in the case of North Africa. And if we think about them, we can adapt them to today's realities. So 2 words, women inclusion and more women everywhere. And the second one, going back to the legacy of our ancestors.
Thank you, Menia. And I want to give the opportunity to Christina, followed by Tariq, and then Joy will close the session for us. Christina, over to you.
Thank you, Gladys. And when Elvis was speaking, you know, I was picturing some pedestrian bridge in Nigeria, where people do not even use the pedestrian bridge. They risk their life and cross the road, because where the pedestrian bridge is built is a distance from the bus stop. So it is clear-cut, people are not consulted. And the pedestrian bridge is even made of stairs. There is no ramp. So how can a person, you know, with disability use that bridge? Who even needs a pedestrian bridge more? I'll give a scenario. Last year, we had a workshop, and usually our workshops are inclusive, and we had a couple of venues, but all of the venues we wanted to use were not inclusive. Now, it was so bad that there was no how we could even use, people with wheelchair, you know, could use the place. Because of our number, we made a case, and on 2 occasions, 2 hotels, you know, agreed to do ramp, you know, for people to move in, which was really great. Now, one of the hotels did a temporary ramp, a wooden ramp, and immediately the meeting was over, they removed it. And for us, it was like, wow, you know, we thought you had some advocacy ruling. What happened? You know, so we have to start discussing with the management to say, you can't have a structure like this, and it's not inclusive. I mean, there are millions of people with disability in this country. Right now, we are battling with getting a venue for a workshop next month, and we are still back to the issue of not having an inclusive space. You know, this is a big issue. People still don't understand the importance of this. We had a meeting last month, and this woman had to be carried with her wheelchair because she could not access the hall. You know, we have this case over and over again. And you know, for me, 2 things really need to be prioritized. We need to have increased sensitization, context-specific sensitization, inclusive. Everybody needs to come to the drawing board. And people need to understand the importance. Whenever I have to travel with my son, it's an issue. If I thought of, you know, the process of having to carry him because there's no wheelchair to carry him even to the plane sometimes, it's even discouraging enough not to want to travel. Yes, we go to some countries and it is so easy. They literally take the weight off you, you know, in taking care of and supporting, you know, your child. So we really need to start having this conversation in Africa. And secondly, we need to hold people to account. There have to be an accountable system. You know, the more accountable, the more we're going to come to civil society and even people demanding for their rights, the more we're able to get better response. Now, there's the need to have a citywide disability literacy. You know, that's the way I like to put it. People need to understand, people need to become literate. You know, the part of policy maker to create enabling environments, civil society, you know, to be able to call government to order, and most importantly, the citizenry need to understand their rights. You know, we must approach disability from the human rights perspective, like I said earlier, not charity, you know, or medical. That is the only way we can really uphold respect and dignity, you know, when talking with persons with disability. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Over to you, Tariq.
Yeah, I have to agree with all of that. All the panelists' points are really spot on. And just to return to the point that Prof. Ibora made right in the beginning about vernacularization and Prof. Joy's point about agency, and also about having the tools and the techniques and the languages to be able to speak to people in. But just to answer the question and end off with that, how do we bring these approaches to the ground? How do we make it part of the everyday? How does it become part of our culture? The rule rather than the exception, because many of these things, even where great work is done, it tends to be more of an exception than the norm. I just want to make 3 points about that. How do we try to make this more systemic, make it more of a cultural practice? I think that the first thing is, as Prof. Joy and others have already said, and Alvis made this point as well, how important a multi-stakeholder consultation is, and having the techniques and the tools and the skills and the soft approaches and soft tools and to be able to do all of that. That is one thing which needs to be normalized, which isn't normalized. The second thing is what the session, the corresponding session yesterday spoke about with creativity. And one of the points, and I think it was Oliminde who made the point there, was she used the word in-betweeners. And she saw herself as an NPO, as an in-betweener. So there is an increasing identification that the civil, the private, the public sector, and also how the public sector does its own operations, the internal workings of government, are very siloed and cut off from one another. And there isn't integrated approaches to things. So you are starting to see increasingly people identifying that there is a space between different arms of society and arms of the state that aren't working together. And this is what Olaminda called in-betweeners. Even the organization of this conference, the African City for Centers, our future cities, these are agencies and organizations that are trying to place themselves between things, to link things together which are siloed from one another, because they're identifying that problem in the operations, the workings of the city government, and how the different sectors of society work together. So that's the second thing. The first thing is the techniques, the multi-stakeholder engagements, the skills required to do that, which must become normalized in our projects. The second thing are these in-betweeners who are actually identifying this chasm that is existing between things that should actually be more integrated. The third thing, I think, is about how we, the political structure that balances and integrates these things. So, as I mentioned in my beginning opening, from civil society, you see lots of humanitarian initiatives, but it actually cannot operate on a scale which it needs to, in an overarching organized political framework, which only the state can do, only the government can do. So the government has to, on the one hand, both ensure people's rights and balance different things, so different things do not overstep one another and exploit one another, but it also needs to play that integrating function. You know, so there are many, and I'll just end off with a few very practical points. There are lots of projects, and I'm here based in Johannesburg, that are really excellent in some ways. A project here, a project there. So we have an informal settlement on the northern periphery of Johannesburg, which is called Diepsloot, which is a project that is currently live, where there is stakeholders with stakeholder engagement with local NGOs in the informal settlement, with girls in sort of high school age. And these are also high migrancy environments, you know, and trying to understand how we can create safety for girls of these age. But this is an exception, but it's the right kind of thing that's happening, but it's unfortunately an exception. We also have something in the southern periphery of Johannesburg, which is also a live project, an informal settlement there, very impoverished area, also high migrancy rates, where they are trying to understand how to create food security. So things can, in public spaces and with schools and with places of worship, and bringing in other experts, agricultural economists, to understand things in a multifaceted kind of a way. So you can deal with migrancy rights, you can deal with food insecurity, you have it's so complex to bring these things together, and they're little blips here and there of excellent initiatives. There are other parks in Johannesburg. Albert spoke very eloquently to all the problems we have in our parks, and everything he said is spot on. You know, but there are some exemplary parks. And it's a very well-known international project, N Street North Park, which worked with school kids. There's another park in Jeppe which did the same. N Street North also working with migrants in that area. These kinds of initiatives have to become the norm rather than the exception? How do we make it a culture? How do we make it something that is systemic, that doesn't just require require urban champions, individuals to drive these initiatives? So just to sum up again, there was the overarching idea of vernacularization and how we ground these things and how we make these everyday concepts, which, as we have seen in the opening address, is actually a historical legacy of a human rights culture that emerges in one particular part of the world, and we have to learn how to make it everyday and vernacularized into our indigenous cultures. We have to learn the techniques to do that, the skills to do that. We have to have organizations that start to link up siloed sectors of government and society, and then we have to have government that can be held accountable, as Christiana said, but that also plays that balancing role, that guards people's rights, and that can bring different projects together in integrated ways.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you. And I'll invite Joy, and then I'll hand over to Fumi.
No, thank you. And I think that all of the panelists have actually, summarized very well indeed. So I'm just going to be repeating what they've said. And I'll repeat it literally by giving us a proverb, an African proverb that I don't know which community it comes from, but there's an African proverb that says that all wisdom does not reside in one head. And I think that this is something that basically the question is asking, that there's no way that one person or one agency or one source can know everything. And so I think that we've all shared some important phrases and insights around how do we do this. We've talked about integrated, we've talked about holistic, we've talked about inclusive, we've talked about transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, we've talked about consultation, we've talked about endogenous knowledge, we've talked about indigenous knowledge, we've talked about lived experience knowledge, we've talked about professional knowledge, technical knowledge and methodologies. We've talked about transferability and non-transferability, meaning context. We've talked about value. And I think that the way to do this is to start. And I'll just end by indicating how we started. In a project of looking at the streets around us, we invited women who are part of a women's organization in real estate, and these comprise young women who are civil engineers, planners, architects, QSs, to join the process and to begin to see how, as they become professionals, they can change the way that they work as professionals, that they actually go to the street to do their work, and that they engage with other people to do their work, just as much as they will return to their desks and synthesize this and try and see how to ideate what they have learned together with people on the street. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to everyone in the panel. I appreciate all your insights, and I hand over to Fumi.
Thank you very much, Gladys. And wow, it's been a fantastic session, way beyond our expectations. And we want to say a huge thank you, first and foremost, to our excellent keynote speakers, Professor Ibawo in absentia, and Joy, thank you so much for pulling together very nicely, very perfectly, all of the ideas today that have come forth from this session. To our discussion facilitator, Gladys, we want to say a very big thank you for holding that space and for holding it really perfectly. And to all of our discussants, Reem, Elvis, Tariq, Christina, and Joy, thanks again for joining the panel and bringing on board your wealth of insight. I want to say thank you to each and every one of you for the insights, the very unique perspectives that you've brought from different kinds of agency of different people within the cities. For this, we want to say a very, very big thank you. And to our very, very engaging audience, we read the comments, we read your questions. Some of your questions filtered through and they were able to get to the discussants, and the discussants were able to respond to so many of them. And we want to say thank you for staying engaged throughout the session. A very, very big thank you to all of you, and to the team at the back, which everybody can't see. It's a huge team, it's a big team. We want to say thank you. I want to say a very special and a big thank you, specifically to the team from ICLEI, the team at Dula Omar Institute, and the team at the Center for Human Rights in the University of Pretoria for pulling together this very insightful session. We say a very, very big thank you.
And in closing, I just want to leave us with just something to think about. This conversation on agency has featured different actors within our cities and their agency or the lack thereof, as we can see from some of the conversations that has come forth. And it's crucial. The conversation has shown that agency is crucial to true development within our cities. In fact, I dare say that it is the starting point for development in our cities. As you leave the session today, can I implore you to sit with yourself for 5 minutes and ask yourself just one very simple question. How can I, through the work that I do and in the space that I hold, foster the reclaiming of agency for a vulnerable person or a vulnerable group in my city today? And I invite you to join us through the day for the remaining discussions that center around agency. Thank you once again, everybody, and see you next year. Bye.